1,000 years, 1,200 years of people doing this to heat themselves up. They're like, I don't have a jacket. I don't have anything else to wear. I'm freezing. How do I keep my core temperature warm?
Scientists just found monks in the Himalayas who haven't aged in centuries. And the first shock was not simply that they were alive. It was that records preserved in remote monasteries, regional archives, and scattered administrative references indicated these men should have belonged to another age entirely. Their names, physical descriptions, and places of residence appeared again and again across spans of time that should have been impossible for any ordinary human being to bridge. What turned a strange mountain legend into a scientific rupture was not a single dramatic sighting, but the slow and unnerving overlap between living bodies and written history. The monks were reportedly encountered in an isolated Himalayan settlement, long shielded by altitude, weather, and cultural distance. The researchers who reached the area expected to find oral tradition, ritual practice, perhaps mummified remains or symbolic titles passed down through generations. Instead, they were confronted with individuals whose faces, posture, features, and identifying marks appeared to match descriptions preserved from centuries earlier. The discovery did not feel like folklore becoming reality. It felt like reality itself had quietly crossed a boundary no one had expected it to survive. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The Himalayas have always occupied a special place in the human imagination because they seem to resist ordinary scale. Distances are deceptive there. Silence feels heavier, and settlements can remain cut off from modern continuity even while the rest of the world accelerates. It is exactly the kind of place where mystery can survive longer than certainty. But this event was not framed as another romantic tale of hidden sages in unreachable valleys. What made it explosive was the collision between environmental isolation, disciplined monastic life, and institutional records that seemed to point to the same impossible conclusion. The monks were said to have lived in recognizable continuity with the past, not as mythic symbols, but as traceable human persons. That distinction matters. Legends can be dismissed as cultural expressions. A body that appears biologically unchanged, while documents insist it has already exceeded every known human limit, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a threat to categories that modern science, medicine, and history depend upon. At the center of the event was aging itself, the most universal process of embodied life and the one humans have never escaped. Every society has rituals to soften it, philosophies to interpret it, and sciences to measure it, but no civilization has ever defeated it. The human body ages through accumulation, cellular wear, DNA damage, inflammatory stress, protein misfolding, hormonal decline, structural breakdown. Even when people live unusually long lives, the signs remain visible. Skin loses elasticity, bone density changes, cognition shifts, muscles weaken, and organs become increasingly fragile. To encounter monks whose apparent age remained fixed while records claimed centuries had passed would not just be surprising. It would force a reconsideration of whether aging is as universal and irreversible as it has always appeared. The event would place one of the oldest assumptions in biology under immediate pressure. If these men truly had not aged in the expected way, then either human physiology is more flexible than modern science has imagined, or the conditions of their existence included a factor science has not yet isolated, measured, or even conceived clearly enough to test. That is why the records mattered so much. Without them, the discovery could have been absorbed into the long history of exaggeration surrounding remote ascetics. But documentation changes the texture of belief. Records give time shape. They make comparison possible. If names associated with these monks appeared across eras, if descriptions remained stable, if local and institutional sources converged, then the event would not rest on one dramatic testimony. It would rest on continuity. That continuity is what makes the title so disturbing. Records say they should not exist. The phrase is powerful because it does not merely suggest rarity. It implies a violation of the timeline itself. History depends on succession. One generation dies and another inherits names, buildings, teachings, and memory. The idea that a handful of individuals persisted bodily through centuries would interrupt that sequence. It would introduce living witnesses into periods that should only be accessible through text, ruin, and reconstruction. These monks would not be interpreters of history. They would be embodied fragments of history still present in the world. The scientific fascination would begin with the body, but it would not end there. In a case like this, the human organism becomes an archive. Skin, eyes, joints, bone, blood chemistry, neural activity, and genetic markers would all become sites of investigation. Every measurable trait would matter. Did these monks display unusual telomere preservation, altered metabolic rhythms, radically suppressed inflammatory pathways, or a stable epigenetic profile unlike any other human population? Was their cellular turnover slowed, redirected, or somehow protected from the cumulative error that defines aging elsewhere? Were they biologically old but outwardly preserved, or were they displaying something much deeper, a systemic resistance to senescence? The event would transform monastic bodies into the most important medical mystery on Earth, not because they were extraordinary in a vague spiritual sense, but because they would represent a direct challenge to everything modern biogerontology takes for granted about decline, time, and mortality. And yet the setting would make the mystery even more difficult to isolate. The Himalayas are not just dramatic mountains. They are environmental extremes. Low oxygen, severe cold, intense sunlight, sparse diet, altitude stress, limited pathogens, unusual microbial ecologies, and deeply structured daily routines create a biological context unlike urban modernity. Monastic life adds another layer. Fasting, meditation, breath control, disciplined sleep, minimal material stimulation, repetitive ritual, emotional regulation, and profound reductions in social and sensory overload. Any scientist trying to understand the event would immediately face a terrifying methodological problem. Was the monks' condition the result of geography, ritual practice, inherited traits, unknown chemistry, rare adaptation, extreme caloric regulation, altered states of consciousness, or some combination that could not easily be separated into variables? The event would therefore not only challenge scientific knowledge, it would challenge scientific method itself. Some phenomena are hard to study because they are hidden. Others are hard to study because everything about them is entangled. This would be both at once. The role of consciousness in the event would become impossible to ignore. Modern science tends to treat thought, belief, attention, and inner training as secondary influences on bodily systems. They matter, but usually at the margins. Stress can worsen disease. Meditation can affect mood, perhaps blood pressure, perhaps immune response, but those effects remain within a familiar framework. A discovery like this would force a more radical question. What if sustained states of consciousness, cultivated over immense spans of time, can regulate physiology far more deeply than current medicine believes? Monastic traditions in the Himalayas have long described the body not merely as flesh, but as a field shaped by breath, awareness, restraint, energy, and intention. Most scientists would not accept such descriptions at face value, but the event would make it much harder to dismiss them as symbolic language. If these monks truly resisted aging, then disciplined consciousness could no longer be treated as a soft cultural factor floating above biology. It would become biologically relevant in a way that medicine has never had to confront seriously. There would also be a severe historical implication. If the monks had persisted across centuries, then they might possess unbroken memory, reaching into periods now known only through fragments. History is built from documents, artifacts, and layered interpretation. It is full of gaps, revisions, and uncertainty. Living witnesses across centuries would be something close to a nightmare for historians, not because they would solve every mystery, but because they would collapse the comfortable boundary between memory and record. These monks could potentially remember rulers, conflicts, migrations, climate conditions, ritual transformations, doctrinal disputes, and cultural shifts that scholars reconstruct only indirectly. They would embody continuity in a world structured by rupture. And yet even this possibility would be unstable, because memory is not a perfect recording system. If minds endure far beyond the ordinary human span, what becomes of recollection? Does memory deepen, simplify, harden, or become more symbolic over time? The event would expose an extraordinary tension between historical evidence and lived remembrance. A being who has seen centuries might know more than any archive, but might also experience time in a way that no historian is trained to interpret. The religious dimension of the event would be equally destabilizing, because it would not simply confirm faith in any easy or triumphant way. Monastic traditions often speak of transcendence, detachment from worldly cycles, and liberation from ordinary patterns of suffering and decay. If monks were discovered who appeared to have stepped partly outside normal aging, many would see that as proof of spiritual attainment. But the event would immediately create a deeper question. What exactly would it mean for a human being to remain present through centuries without visibly entering the decay common to all other bodies? Would that count as holiness, biological anomaly, or something in between? It would place spiritual practice and scientific inquiry in direct contact, yet not in a simple conflict. Each would be forced to recognize the other. Science could no longer dismiss contemplative discipline as merely subjective if it seemed tied to radical bodily outcomes. Spiritual traditions, meanwhile, would face scrutiny over whether their teachings describe symbolic transformation, literal transformation, or truths that become distorted when placed under laboratory attention. The phrase "they shouldn't exist" carries a philosophical weight even beyond biology and religion. Human existence is normally measured by finitude. Mortality gives urgency to choice, meaning to inheritance, and structure to social life. Childhood, adulthood, old age, and death are not just biological stages. They are the architecture of human expectation. If a small group of people had somehow remained alive and unaged for centuries, they would not merely present a medical exception. They would expose how deeply human civilization depends on the assumption that everyone leaves. Laws, families, politics, property, education, memory, art, and ethics all presume turnover. One generation prepares for the next because it knows it will disappear. A being who does not move through time in that way stands partly outside the human social contract. The event would therefore provoke a profound discomfort. The monks would still look human, speak human languages, occupy human spaces, and belong to human traditions. But their relation to time would be alien enough to unsettle the definition of what a human life is supposed to be. It would also force renewed attention on the difference between longevity and duration. Humans already fantasize constantly about longer life. Medicine extends lifespan. Technology promises optimization. Wealthy cultures chase youth through surgery, supplementation, and self-surveillance. But those pursuits are aimed at prolonging the familiar arc, not escaping it. The Himalayan monks, if the reports were true, would represent duration without visible surrender to age. That is a much more dangerous idea than ordinary longevity. It suggests not merely more years, but a different arrangement between time and body. This would electrify every debate about life extension, but it would also expose something spiritually thin in modern obsession with anti-aging. Most contemporary fantasies of extended life are built on fear, control, vanity, and market logic. The monks, by contrast, would seem to emerge from renunciation, stillness, discipline, and withdrawal from consumption. The event would therefore create a brutal contrast. The world most desperate to delay aging does so through restless intervention, while the only apparent evidence of escaping aging comes from men who turned away from the world's cravings almost entirely. The implications for medicine would be staggering even before any intervention or application was imagined. The existence of such monks would suggest that aging might not be a single unstoppable process, but a network of processes that can, under very rare conditions, be profoundly altered. That possibility alone would redraw medical priorities. Instead of treating age-related disease as inevitable decline to be managed, researchers might begin asking whether the body contains dormant capacities for preservation that modern life suppresses or overwhelms. The event would push medicine toward a more integrated view of the organism, one in which metabolism, nervous regulation, environmental rhythm, attention, and long-term behavior are not peripheral health modifiers, but central determinants of biological time. The idea of health would widen dramatically. Rather than separating the body into specialized systems, the discovery would reward a view of life as coherence. The monks would appear to embody a state in which mind, behavior, environment, and physiology had entered a pattern stable enough to resist the erosion that usually defines aging. At the same time, the event would raise a terrifying possibility that modern civilization may be structured in ways fundamentally hostile to human longevity at the deepest level. If mountain monks living under conditions of discipline and simplicity displayed biological stability unavailable to modern populations, then aging might not be only a natural process. It might also be amplified by the ordinary design of contemporary life. Constant stress, artificial light, processed food, sedentary habits, pollution, emotional overstimulation, social fragmentation, and endless acceleration could appear less like unfortunate side conditions and more like active participants in the body's decay. The monks, in that sense, would not simply be miracles in isolation, they would be mirrors held up to the rest of humanity. Their existence would imply that what most people call normal life may actually be a continuous assault on the biological systems that sustain balance over time. That is one reason the event would grip the imagination so forcefully. It would not remain confined to a remote monastery. It would reach directly into every city, office, home, and screen-lit bedroom in the world. There is also the problem of identity over immense stretches of time. If a monk has lived for centuries, what does personhood look like inside such continuity? Modern psychology is built around development through finite stages. A child becomes an adult, gathers memory, suffers loss, constructs narrative, and eventually confronts decline. The self changes because the body changes, society changes, and death approaches. But a person who persists through centuries without ordinary aging may not experience selfhood in the same way at all. Desire might alter, attachment might thin, memory might stop functioning as a personal story and begin operating more like layers of weathered landscape. The event would force philosophy and psychology to ask whether human identity is inherently tied to mortality. Perhaps a self that no longer moves clearly toward death is no longer structured by urgency, achievement, ambition, or even conventional emotion in the way ordinary lives are. The monks would thus become important not only for what their bodies reveal, but for what their existence might reveal about consciousness under conditions of extreme temporal extension. The social symbolism of the event would be just as powerful. Monks occupy a peculiar place in global imagination. They are associated with discipline, withdrawal, wisdom, and endurance. They are figures who reject ordinary ambition in favor of contemplation. That such beings, rather than kings, generals, billionaires, or scientific elites, might become the center of the greatest biological mystery in history would carry enormous symbolic force. It would suggest that the deepest human breakthroughs may emerge not from conquest or accumulation, but from reduction. Not from expansion into the world, but from radical stillness within it. This would disturb the dominant mythology of progress. Modernity celebrates innovation, speed, extraction, and optimization. The monks would appear to stand for the opposite principles: repetition, patience, restraint, silence, and inward refinement. The event would therefore not only challenge medicine, it would challenge civilizational values. It would imply that a life arranged around mastery of attention may unlock truths inaccessible to a life arranged around mastery of things. Another implication would concern the relationship between secrecy and knowledge. The monks were reportedly not discovered in a laboratory, a hospital, or a major city. They were found in a place where local tradition, physical inaccessibility, and cultural insulation allowed an anomaly to persist outside the systems that define official knowledge. That fact alone would be destabilizing. Modern science often assumes that reality yields itself most reliably under institutional observation. Yet this event would suggest that transformative knowledge can survive beyond those institutions, guarded not by advanced technology, but by remoteness, ritual continuity, and the refusal to become visible. The monk's existence, if genuine, would imply that not everything important announces itself to modern frameworks of discovery. Some truths may remain hidden precisely because the conditions that preserve them are incompatible with exposure. This would not romanticize secrecy, but it would complicate the arrogance of visibility. The world may contain realities that only survive by not being legible to the systems that most confidently define what is real. There would also be enormous implications for anthropology and the study of tradition. Too often, remote monastic cultures are viewed through two distorted lenses. One treats them as sacred curiosities, timeless and mystical. The other treats them as anthropological remnants, interesting but ultimately peripheral to the main arc of modern human knowledge. This event would destroy both simplifications. If these monks truly had not aged in centuries, then their community would no longer be peripheral to global knowledge. It would become central. Ritual practices dismissed as archaic might suddenly appear as encoded biological technologies. Dietary rules, meditative methods, breathing disciplines, sleeping patterns, and seasonal rhythms might contain a logic far more sophisticated than outsiders recognized. The event would show how easily modernity mistakes unfamiliar knowledge for primitive custom. It would remind the world that civilizations do not all pursue truth in the same form. Some write equations, some build devices, some refine the body and mind across generations until a hidden capacity emerges. The monks would represent a lineage in which knowledge was stored not only in text, but in disciplined embodiment. The emotional power of the event comes partly from its intimacy with a universal fear. Aging is not abstract. It enters every household. People watch parents become fragile, watch their own faces change, feel the body stiffen, feel memory become more selective, and slowly understand that time is not passing around them but through them. That is why a story like this becomes magnetic so quickly. It does not merely offer wonder, it touches the deepest ache in human life. The desire that decline might not be inevitable, that time might not always take in the same way, that some hidden path could exist between flesh and endurance. But the monks make that desire more complicated, not less. Their apparent escape from aging would not resemble the glamorous fantasies of youth culture. It would be austere, remote, disciplined, and spiritually charged. This matters because it changes the emotional meaning of the event. It does not promise easy rescue from mortality. It suggests that if there is any secret in the human organism that resists time, it may require a total transformation of how life is lived, perceived, and valued. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on monks not aging for centuries? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.